Many Western practitioners first discovered Buddhist philosophy after experiencing ego death, selflessness, or non-duality while on psychedelics. Mainstream monastics generally reject psychedelic use, citing the Fifth Precept, which warns against intoxicants that may cloud the mind. However, modern scholars, practitioners, and teachers argue that intentional psychedelic use may act as an insightful spiritual tool. Today, we explore the origins and history of this debate, and we'll investigate whether this correlation is accidental or purposeful. Buddhism finds its origins in ancient India in the 5th or 6th century BCE. It was founded by Siddhartha Gautama, called the Buddha, a spiritual teacher and former prince from the Himalayan foothills who achieved enlightenment while meditating under the Bodhi or wisdom tree. Buddhist teachings center on what are called the Four Noble Truths and the Eightfold Path. Buddhism emphasizes understanding the nature of suffering, called dukkha, and practicing morality, meditation, and perception to achieve enlightenment or nirvana. After the Buddha's death at the age of 80, the religion remained largely localized in northern India for about 200 years. It expanded rapidly in the 3rd century BCE under Ashoka the Great, who made it a state religion and sent missionaries across Asia. Over centuries, it evolved into major branches, including Theravada, Mahayana, Vajrayana, and Zen, and spread throughout Southeast, Central, and East Asia. Esoteric Buddhist lineages may have historically utilized psychoactive mushrooms, hallucinogenic plants, or visionary alchemical elixirs. Today, some Vajrayana practitioners openly incorporate psychedelics into Tantric feast offerings, asserting that these sacraments help dismantle diluted perceptions. In certain lineages of Indo-Tibetan Vajrayana Buddhism, texts like the Anuttara Yoga Tantra and Vajramahabhairava Tantra make esoteric references to the ritual consumption of plants such as cannabis and datura. These were utilized to induce altered states of awareness aimed at transcending conventional thought and facilitating spiritual awakening. Researchers like Lama Mike Crowley, a scholar of the Kagyu tradition, argue that psychoactive mushrooms were central to the genesis of Vajrayana Buddhism. Crowley's thesis suggests that early tantric adepts called siddhas consumed the Amanita muscaria or fly agaric mushroom, as well as the Psilocybe cubensis mushroom, as secret ingredients in their elixirs to achieve enlightenment, often cloaking these practices within alchemical mythology. Other scholars suggest that entheogenic plants were frequently incorporated into Buddhist allegories, metaphors, and symbolic iconography via the concept of Amrita, the nectar of the gods, traditionally linked to the earlier Vedic Soma. In this view, Buddhist deities, nimbus halos, and ritual umbrellas called chhatras are interpreted by some researchers as symbolic representations of psychoactive mushrooms, with texts describing visionary and psychedelic experiences. In contemporary Buddhism, the intersection of entheogens and Dharma practice is heavily debated. While orthodox practitioners view psychedelics as a hindrance that leads to heedlessness, some modern psychedelic Buddhists argue that these substances can occasionally offer meditative insights or glimpses of nirvana. Before we begin, I want to take a moment and thank our monthly members. You help to fuel the enlightening education that benefits many around the world. Your support enables S.E.E.K to continue creating content, providing a path for all spiritual seekers. Support us with a monthly membership on YouTube, Patreon, or Ko-Fi at Join S.E.E.K, or on Facebook at Join S.E.E.K1. Become a member and you will see your name in future videos. Thank you. As we move forward, we need to separate what the earliest scriptures clearly say from later interpretations, symbolic readings, and regional ritual practices that grew around Buddhism over time. That distinction matters because the historical record is layered, and esoteric evidence is often indirect, metaphorically encoded, and deliberately veiled. If you have not already seen our earlier video on the history of Buddhism, please do so after this in order to gain the full backdrop onto which this exploration elaborates. Ancient India already knew sacred psychoactive and fermented sacraments, and the broader Indo-Iranian world carried rituals surrounding visionary elixirs and divine drinks. Early Vedic scriptures like the Rig Veda and pre-Buddhist texts of ancient India detail a mysterious mind-altering sacrament called Soma, analogous to the Zoroastrian Hauma found in the Avesta. Ethnobotanists like R. Gordon Wasson speculate that this was derived from the Amanita muscaria or fly agaric mushroom, similar to the rites of Siberian shamanism, while scholar Terence McKenna put forth the Psilocybe cubensis or magic mushroom. And authors like David Flattery favor plants like Syrian rue or Peganum harmala, with the modern botanical substitute remaining a species of ephedra. There is an argument to be made that the ancient Soma may have been a combination of Amanita muscaria and Psilocybe cubensis, hidden within the iconography of Skanda, the revered Hindu god of war, victory, wisdom, and the commander of the celestial armies. Skanda is depicted as riding a blue peacock, and also carries a flag emblazoned with the image of a red rooster. This combination of blue and red suggests the two kinds of psychoactive fungi we have been considering: the blue staining psilocybian species and the brilliant red fly agaric. Buddhism emerged in conversation with that landscape, partly inheriting it and partly rejecting it, which is why the Buddhist relationship to altered states has always been complex rather than simple. In that environment, plants, minerals, resins, fermented beverages, and symbolic nectars were never far from religious imagination, even when the canonical Buddhist ideal emphasized restraint. The fifth precept in many Buddhist traditions warns against intoxicants that cloud the mind and lead to carelessness, and that ethical frame has shaped Buddhist attitudes for centuries. The Pali word for intoxication is pamada, which roughly translates to heedlessness, negligence, or carelessness. Adherents argue that while substances like alcohol induce stupor and lead to unethical behavior, psychedelics often heighten one's heedfulness, self-awareness, and empathy. The core of the precept is to avoid muddying the mind and losing control. Psychedelic Buddhists argue that when used intentionally as tools for spiritual insight or mental exploration, rather than to escape reality, psychedelics fulfill a therapeutic or spiritual role. Traditional Buddhist goals like non-self or anatta, and emptiness or shunyata, can be difficult for lay practitioners to conceptualize. Advocates suggest psychedelics can provide a powerful, direct glimpse into the illusion of the ego, essentially kickstarting the spiritual journey. Some practitioners argue that strict prohibitions on substances are a modern conservative invention, noting that psychoactive plants or sacramental wines have historically played roles in various esoteric or indigenous lineages. At the same time, later Buddhist cultures developed rich ritual languages of ambrosia, nectar, medicine, and transformation, especially in Tantric and Vajrayana settings, of which we will discuss momentarily. Terms like Amrita, Soma, Rasa, and nectar appear as symbols of immortality, awakening, and the purification of body and mind. That symbolic vocabulary matters because esoteric Buddhism often works through correspondences, where external ritual and internal realization mirror one another. In that sense, Buddhism belongs to a wider esoteric and entheogenic world, in which chemical, ritual, and contemplative methods sometimes overlap, even when a tradition publicly disavows intoxication. The canonical monastic code and the Five Precepts give Buddhism a clear ethical baseline against heedlessness and loss of mindfulness. Yet, Buddhism also teaches that ordinary perception is distorted by ignorance, craving, and habitual grasping, so the goal is not just sobriety in a medical sense, but awakening in a metaphysical sense. That creates a fascinating tension. Buddhism often rejects substances that cloud the mind, while also seeking experiences that radically transform perception. At the same time, Buddhism repeatedly warns that altered states can become another form of attachment, if not integrated into discipline and insight. So the history here is not a simple celebration of sacred intoxication, but a long tension between awakening practices and the dangers of mistaking experience for liberation. Buddhism evolved through two major historical vehicles: Theravada, often historically called Hinayana or Lesser Vehicle, and Mahayana or Greater Vehicle. Theravada and Mahayana Buddhism share core foundations, but diverge significantly in their ultimate goals, scriptural focus, and cultural expressions. Both schools share foundational doctrines, including the Four Noble Truths, which acknowledge suffering and the path to its end, as well as the Eightfold Path, which is the practical method for achieving liberation. Both schools believe actions have consequences and beings cycle through lifetimes, emphasized in the doctrines of karma and rebirth. Both schools also share in the philosophy of the three marks of existence: impermanence or anicca, suffering or dukkha, and non-self or anatta, with the ultimate goal being the escape from the cycle of death and rebirth called samsara, with the attainment of nirvana. The tradition shifted from an individual monastic pursuit of enlightenment to universal salvation, incorporating esoteric rituals and sudden experiential awakening. Zen and Vajrayana developed as specialized paths within Mahayana Buddhism, both emerging as skillful means to accelerate enlightenment to a single lifetime, rather than over countless reincarnations. They fundamentally share the Mahayana core of compassion, emptiness, and the bodhisattva ideal, which is the forsaking of nirvana to help all sentient beings inch closer to enlightenment. But these schools differ in methods. Zen focuses on direct meditative experience, while Vajrayana utilizes esoteric tantric rituals. In Vajrayana Buddhism, the most revealing language is often not the language of intoxication, but the language of transformation. Scholarly and historical evidence suggests that entheogenic sacraments, particularly cannabis, datura, and psychoactive mushrooms, played a significant role in the origins and development of Vajrayana or Tantric Buddhism in India, though mainstream traditions no longer actively use these substances. The practitioner does not merely consume something. The practitioner participates in a ritual economy where body, speech, and mind are consciously reorganized through mantra, mudra, visualization, and offering. Because many Vajrayana practices originated from the Indian Mahasiddhas or Great Adepts, the tradition absorbed many elements of Shaivite or Shiva-worshipping shamanism. Shiva is the patron deity of cannabis in Indian history, and this association heavily influenced the left-hand transgressive methods sometimes explored in esoteric Buddhist texts. High-altitude valleys of the Hindu Kush and the Himalayas are the natural evolutionary birthplace of cannabis. Amrita, or the nectar of immortality, appears in this context as both a metaphor and a ritual substance, associated with purification, blessing, and the dissolution of ordinary duality. Amrita is mythologically associated with the churning of the ocean of milk, or Samudra Manthana, a foundational myth wherein gods and demons churn the cosmic ocean to manifest the elixir of immortal life. In the Tibetan Buddhist text, the Immaculate Crystal Garland, the Vedic Soma is revealed to be the origin of the Buddhist Amrita. While Soma and Amrita are used interchangeably in Hinduism, Tibetan Buddhism only refers to the sacrament as Amrita. In this Buddhist version, the pantheon of Buddhas and Bodhisattvas, led by Vajrapani, gathers on Mount Meru to procure the nectar of life called Dutsi, another word for Amrita, from the depths of the ocean. The intention is to create an antidote against Hala, a deadly poison spread by demons to torment humanity. To bring the nectar to the surface, they churn the ocean using Mount Meru. During this churning process, a variety of potent transformative substances emerge, leading to the creation of the ultimate elixir. Amitayus, meaning infinite life, is the Sambhogakaya or celestial aspect of Amitabha Buddha, one of the most widely revered figures in Mahayana Buddhism. Amitayus is adorned with the Sambhogakaya ornaments and holds a flask of Amrita. Growing out of the Amrita flask of Amitayus is Parijata, the legendary wish-granting tree which emerged along with Amrita at the churning of the ocean. A tree being associated with Amrita suggests a connection with the psychoactive fly agaric or Amanita muscaria mushroom. A symbiotic relationship with the roots of a host tree is essential for its existence. We see similar iconographic motifs in the biblical story of Adam and Eve, with the fruit associated with the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. It may be no coincidence that both Amitabha and Amitayus are bright red, the color of the fly agaric, a visionary sacrament also depicted in the plain chorale chapel fresco of the fruit in the book of Genesis. In some traditions, nectar is imagined as flowing from the awakened body and crown, or as being generated through the ritual fusion of elements in a kapala, a Tibetan ritual skull cup that evokes the transmutation of death into wisdom. This is where Buddhist esotericism becomes especially important, because it shares structural similarities with Hindu Tantra, alchemical thought, and other initiatory traditions that treat impurity as raw material for awakening. While modern Amrita is simply blessed water, some researchers, most notably Lama Mike Crowley in Secret Drugs of Buddhism, argue that early Vajrayana Amrita was a potent entheogenic brew, analogous to the Hindu Soma. Crowley provides evidence for this claim through references to city drugs and rasayana elixirs in texts like the Yogini Tantras. This substitution from literal to metaphorical visionary sacrament can be compared to modern Hinduism and contemporary Zoroastrian spiritual systems, with the substitution of the original Soma or Halma sacraments for ephedra species, as well as the Taoist move from external elixirs called Waidon to internal alchemy called Nadon. In Jerry and Julie Brown's work, The Psychedelic Gospels, they also argue that the original Christian Eucharist providing transubstantiation was originally psychedelic and moved to a metaphorical sacrament over time. In tantric settings, the body itself becomes a mandala, ritual substances become offerings, and imagery of nectar, union, and bliss can signal a path of sacred transformation. This is where Buddhism begins to resemble other mystery traditions, from Hindu Tantra to ancient initiatory systems, that treated altered awareness as a gateway rather than a distraction. Even when no drug is involved, the symbolic logic of entheogenesis, or God or truth within, encountered through transformation, can be strongly present in Buddhist ritual and contemplative language. In some tantric lineages, the practitioner is taught to visualize Amrita flowing through channels, purifying toxins, and generating bliss that is not dependent on external substances. Yet the same texts often use pharmacological metaphors. Medicine, poison, cure, and elixir appear repeatedly, suggesting that the ritual imagination is deeply informed by real-world knowledge of substances. Here, Buddhism mirrors other esoteric spiritual systems that blend chemistry, ritual, and contemplation, such as Ayurveda, Taoist alchemy, and Hermetic magic. In all of these systems, the goal is not simple intoxication, but a reordered consciousness that can perceive reality more directly. In the next section, we'll continue to trace that development into Tantra, where the boundary between medicine, sacrament, and metaphor becomes increasingly difficult to illustrate. As Buddhism moves into the Tantric world, its language of restraint begins to coexist with the alchemical vocabulary of nectar, empowerment, purification, and sacred embodiment. When we move into Tantric systems, this conversation becomes more explicit, because Tantra treats body, emotion, and desire as potential vehicles for realization. Certain Tibetan myths involve deities drinking urine or transforming Amrita into urine. Researchers suggest this strange symbolic motif mirrors shamanic Siberian practices of drinking reindeer urine to recycle and enhance the psychoactive effects of the Amanita muscaria mushroom. Siberian shamans and their followers drank urine as a built-in filtration system for consuming Amanita muscaria or fly agaric mushrooms for altering awareness. The mushroom's psychoactive compounds, muscimol and ibotenic acid, pass through the body unaltered, but lose their highly toxic, nausea-inducing properties in the initial consumer's liver. This practice allowed indigenous groups like the Koryak people of eastern Siberia to experience the mushroom's hallucinogenic vision quests while safely bypassing the worst physical side effects. While early Buddhism shunned intoxicants, scholars have identified probable entheogenic practices within medieval Tantric Vajrayana Buddhism, particularly in the Indo-Tibetan regions. The Tara Tantra is a 7th century Hindu Shakta Tantra text, but features the Buddha. It asserts that cannabis is essential to ecstasy. In the text, the Buddha is said to state that drinking wine without cannabis cannot produce real ecstasy, serving as a catalyst for realizing spiritual bliss. The Chakra Samvara Tantra is a foundational Vajrayana text from the late 8th century that references sauna or hemp in combination with other ingredients. Published between the 8th and 12th centuries, the Mahakala Tantra contains detailed materia medica and magical instructions. Cannabis is included in its perfect medicine formulas, employed for healing, developing magical powers, and as offerings to deities. An 11th century commentary on the Kala Chakra Tantra by Pundarika details offerings involving datura that result in a compound becoming a magical ointment for the eyes. After applying it, the practitioner supposedly feels as though they are revolving around like a bee. Attributed to the Buddhist philosopher Nagarjuna around the 12th century, the Yogaratna Mala recommends utilizing the smoke of the cannabis plant as a method to thwart one's enemies. The Vajramahabhairava Tantra contains specific references to the use of datura for magico-religious and psycho-spiritual practices. In the context of the Yogini Tantras, texts prescribe the use of datura and cannabis called bhang in fire offerings and ritual pills. The smoke and ingestion of these plants were meant to transform diluted states like anger and desire into awakened wisdom. The foundational Anuttara Yoga Tantra describes the ingestion of plant materials and passion seeds, potentially referencing cannabis and datura, which contain psychoactive alkaloids. Furthermore, some historical texts detail fire ceremonies in which the smoke of datura was inhaled, allowing the active alkaloids to survive burning and achieve rapid transdermal or pulmonary absorption. These substances were ingested at strategic points in the ceremony to facilitate states of heightened awareness during meditation. Certain deities and myths in Vajrayana or Tantric Buddhism are strongly associated with entheogenic plant use. The Sanskrit name Unmata means delirious or intoxicated. This name is a common adjective for deities like Bhairava, who is an important meditational deity in Vajrayana Buddhism, serving as a symbolic association with the wild, transgressive nature of the Tantric practitioner. In the legends of the 84 Mahasiddhas, we find the story of the Siddha Savaripa. The name of this Siddha implies that he was a member of the Savari or Sabari, a non-Aryan indigenous tribe. Legend has it that he was a hunter who lived in the hills of Vikrama. Savaripa was cruel and he slew untold numbers of antelope. In order to save the remaining antelope, Avalokiteshvara, the Bodhisattva of compassion, disguised himself as a hunter and appeared before him. Boastful Savaripa challenged, "How many antelope can you slay with one shot?" 500 usually, was Avalokiteshvara's reply. Savaripa did not believe him. "Prove it," he said. Avalokiteshvara magically created a large number of antelope and made them all graze in the glade. When he was about to shoot, Savaripa said sarcastically, "Just 100 will do." With just one arrow, Avalokiteshvara killed every one of the antelope. We can but wonder whether all those antelope might not really have been mushrooms. One possible connection might be that the spotted coat of a young fawn is reminiscent of the spotted cap of Amanita muscaria. In a curious parallel, the Huichol or Washarika people of Mexico consider a spotted fawn to symbolize the spirit of the psychedelic cactus peyote, called hikuri. Considering that the ancestors of all Native Americans migrated from Siberia, where Amanita muscaria is the drug of choice, this folkway may reflect a transference of an ancient mushroom tradition to a cactus. Because of its psychedelic effects, the cactus may be seen to possess the spirit of the ancestral sacrament. Researchers have also linked the physical characteristics and accoutrements of specific Vajrayana deities to entheogenic mushrooms, like Amanita muscaria or psilocybe species. The parasol or umbrella, called a chhatra, is a common feature in Buddhist art, and is theorized to symbolize these mushroom species. There is a legend that the king of the chthonic serpent spirits, called Nagaraja, presented the Buddha with a jewel-encrusted umbrella. It is gold with a sapphire handle, and its edges are studded with jewels, including diamonds which shine like the sun. The jewels give off a nectar which can quench the thirst of all sentient beings. The passage may be alternatively read as a mushroom with a gold-colored cap and blue-staining stem, and remnants of a coordinate veil attached to the outer edge of the cap is a source of the psychedelic sacrament. Within the geographical area of India where the Tantric cults flourished, there are a few species of psychoactive mushrooms that stain blue, most notably Psilocybe cubensis and Panaeolus cambodigeniensis, both of which are highly potent hallucinogenic mushrooms. When we move from Indian origins to Mahayana expansion to the full flowering of Tibetan Vajrayana, we begin to read esoteric Buddhism as a path that transforms desire rather than suppressing it. That transformation is sometimes expressed through the imagery of bliss, union, nectar, and drinks of immortality, which echoes entheogenic language in other spiritual systems. In the Mahayana world, the doctrine of emptiness and the ideal of compassion create a philosophical space where ordinary boundaries between substance and spirit can loosen. In that imagination, bliss, emptiness, form, and non-duality are not just abstract doctrines, they are lived through ritual technologies that aim to destabilize ordinary perception. In Buddhism, nirvana is the ultimate state of liberation from suffering called dukkha, and the cycle of rebirth called samsara. This is one reason Buddhist Tantra is often compared with the mystery religions of the ancient world, where initiates move through symbolic death, rebirth, and revelation. The esoteric point is not to escape into trance, but to transform consciousness into wisdom. The Buddha is reimagined not only as a teacher, but as a cosmic presence, a Tathagata, or one who has thus gone, whose body is Dharma, or cosmic order itself, which opens the possibility that ritual matter might participate in awakening. This is not entheogen use in a narrow sense, but it is a metaphysical shift that allows sacred sacraments to become more than mere symbols. While there are theoretical traces of entheogenic sacraments in early Buddhist traditions, Mahayana philosophy itself does not require psychoactive substances to validate its teachings. Instead, scholars view psychedelic experiences as a potential chemical sneak peek into Mahayana tenets. The concept of shunyata, or emptiness, is the philosophical understanding that all phenomena lack inherent independent existence, which can be experientially induced by ego-dissolving entheogens. Altered states of awareness frequently catalyze intense feelings of interconnectedness, mirroring the Mahayana concept of an interdependent universe. The Buddhist idea of dependent origination suggests that the self is not a fixed entity, but a process arising through conditions, which makes altered states especially intriguing because they temporarily rearrange those conditions. When people report ego dissolution, compassion, visions, or encounters with luminous emptiness, Buddhist interpreters often read those experiences as hints of non-self, rather than as proof of ultimate attainment. That is why the language of integration is so important. The practice is not complete when the vision ends, but when the practitioner returns to ordinary life with more patience, generosity, and insight. In East Asian Mahayana, terms like medicine Buddha, nectar, and Pure Land can evoke a world where healing, purification, and bliss are central to the path. The language of deathless and immortal appears in many Buddhist forms, echoing the Indo-Iranian idea of Soma or Hauma and the Hellenic idea of ambrosia, but now recast as the deathlessness of awakening. That resonance is not accidental. It shows that Buddhism is part of a larger spiritual conversation across Asia and the Mediterranean about how to touch immortality. The 5 meats, 5 nectars, and the ritual balancing of elements reveal a symbolic universe in which what is normally taboo can be recontextualized as a vehicle of realization. The Chakra Samvara Tantra, a revered text in Newar Buddhism, references the 5 intoxicants, the root, stem, leaves, flowers, and fruit of Datura, within magical and ritual contexts. Such imagery does not prove the routine use of psychoactive drugs, but it does show that Buddhism had a sophisticated sacramental imagination, capable of metabolizing the language of altered states. The 5 poisons can become 5 wisdoms. Ordinary intoxication can be reinterpreted as a destabilization that reveals non-duality. And ritual substances can be seen as carriers of blessing. If we read Buddhist Tantra through the lens of comparative esotericism, we can see that the entheogenic question is not only about whether a drug was used, but about how a tradition constructs altered states as sacred. Buddhism answers that question with a hybrid strategy. It warns against heedless intoxication, while simultaneously offering ritual technologies that can destabilize ordinary perception in a controlled way. That strategy is shared with other esoteric systems, from Hindu sadhana to shamanic initiation, where danger, discipline, and transformation go together. The next key point is understanding that Buddhism does not stand alone here. It is woven into a larger network that includes Hindu Tantra, yogic alchemy, and indigenous shamanic practices across Asia and beyond. Understanding that network is essential for seeing how entheogenic possibilities can be hidden, expressed, or encoded in Buddhist forms. In the Himalayas, Buddhist Tantra and indigenous shamanism have long coexisted, sometimes in tension, sometimes in fusion. The Himalayan foothills house an incredible diversity of ethno-medical plants. Indigenous and Adivasi communities in the region possess profound traditional knowledge of brewing wild-crafted plants and utilizing regional psychoactive flora for divination and religious rites. Known locally as city drugs or Rasayana elixirs, entheogenic preparations were intentionally utilized to facilitate deep meditation, stabilize the mind, and heighten sensory awareness during complex ritual practices. At least one community in modern India, the Santal tribe of Bihar state, claims to be aware of a psychoactive mushroom which grows on cattle dung, matching descriptions and conditions of Psilocybe cubensis or magic mushrooms. The early Tantric masters, called the Mahasiddhas, operated in the fluid religious landscape of India and Nepal, absorbing local shamanic, Bon or Bun, and Shaivite practices. Archaeological and anthropological research indicates that they actively harvested and consumed psychoactive botanicals to induce profound visions, integral to deity yoga and subtle inner body practices. Buddhist monasteries and lay communities in Tibet, Nepal, Bhutan, and the Himalayan belt have often lived in close contact with indigenous, shamanic, and tantric worlds, where medicine and sacrament frequently blur. One of the most interesting pieces of evidence in the broader Buddhist world is not a canonical sermon, but the ritual and regional life that developed around Buddhism in Himalayan and trans-Himalayan cultures. In Nepal and neighboring regions, mad honey traditions have long existed alongside Buddhist communities, and the honey's grayanotoxin content produces dizziness, hallucinations, and other altered effects. Mad honey from Nepal is a rare dark red honey produced by giant Himalayan bees that feed on rhododendron nectar. Prized for its entheogenic properties, it contains grayanotoxin, a neurotoxin that alters brain chemistry to cause intoxication, altered temperature sensations, and vivid hallucinations. The honey hunting ritual itself is embedded in cosmology, danger, reverence, and communal knowledge, which makes it a compelling example of how psychoactive experience can sit near Buddhist culture even when it is not strictly Buddhist doctrine. That matters because religious history is not made only in scripture, it is also made in border zones, in mountain valleys, in healing lineages, in agricultural rites, and in the practical use of medicinal sacraments. The language of nectar, blessing, and healing in Tibetan Buddhism often overlaps with the local knowledge of medicinal plants, resins, and fermented sacraments, even if the monastic texts do not name them explicitly. This creates a layered religious practice where the orthodox norm of non-intoxication is maintained in scriptures, while localized ritual worlds may include medicinal or visionary sacraments that function entheogenically. Such layered practice is common in esoteric spiritual systems globally, where a public doctrine of restraint coexists with a hidden or regional path of transformative experience. In that sense, the entheogenic evidence in Buddhism is often indirect, embedded in ritual imagery, regional customs, and esoteric lineages, rather than in straightforward canonical statements. That is why some modern scholars and practitioners are cautious about claiming that Buddhism was originally psychedelic, because the earliest texts do not support that kind of simple reading. Yet, caution about one claim should not erase the more nuanced picture. Buddhism developed in a world where sacred altered states were widespread, and it absorbed some of that language into its own symbolic and ritual systems. The result is a spiritual system that can be read as both sober and visionary, both disciplined and transformative, depending on which layer you look at. That complexity is what makes Buddhism a crucial part of the broader entheogenic history of religions, because it shows how a tradition can reframe altered states without fully endorsing intoxication. A careful historical reading suggests that Buddhism did not begin as an entheogenic religion, but it developed in a world where entheogenic possibilities, sacred drinks, visionary rituals, and esoteric embodiment were already culturally available. Some Buddhist forms rejected those currents, some domesticated them symbolically, and some reworked them into initiatory ritual language. That is why the entheogenic evidence in Buddhism is best understood as a spectrum rather than a single claim. It stretches from ethical prohibition, to symbolic nectar, to tantric transmutation, to regional sacred intoxication, living at the margins of Buddhist orthodoxy. This Buddhist strategy of transformation is not isolated. It becomes part of a larger conversation that stretches across cultures, continents, and centuries. Comprehending that conversation is essential to contemplate how entheogenic evidence in Buddhism is both specific to its context and resonant with wider patterns. When Buddhism spread across Asia, it encountered local traditions that already used plants, resins, and fermented substances for ritual and healing purposes. In China, it met Taoist alchemy, Wu shamanism, and folk religions with their own nectar and medicine imagery. In Japan, it encountered indigenous Ainu shamanic and ritual practices. In Korea, it heavily merged with indigenous Korean Muism, or Korean shamanistic folk religion. In Tibet and the Himalayas, it absorbed indigenous Bon and other shamanic and medicinal knowledge. In each region, the Buddhist language of nectar and transformation could fuse with local entheogenic or medicinal practices, creating hybrid ritual worlds that are difficult to categorize strictly as Buddhist or non-Buddhist. Not intoxication in the mundane sense, but a ritualized transgression that reveals the non-dual nature of reality. Such transgressive methods are common in global esoteric spiritual systems, where the boundary between poison and medicine is deliberately crossed to show that appearance and reality are not the same. When we compare this to other esoteric frameworks, we can see similar patterns. Hindu Tantra that uses ritual sacraments and transgressive practices, Taoist alchemy that seeks internal nectar, and shamanic traditions that use plants to open the veil. In all of these, the point is not chemical escape, but spiritual access, and Buddhism offers its own version of that access through mantra, visualization, and nectar imagery. In Tibetan Vajrayana, the practitioner is often taught to generate bliss through subtle body practices, where channels, winds, and drops are manipulated to produce an inner experience of non-ordinary consciousness. This inner bliss is not a side effect but a method, a way of using the body's own energy to access emptiness and compassion. In that sense, Buddhism's entheogenic evidence is not only about substances, but about a method of transformation that echoes entheogenic logic even when no drug is present. When we place this in a broader esoteric and entheogenic context, Buddhism becomes another node in a network of spiritual lineages that all ask how matter, body, and mind can be used to access the divine or the deathless state of immortality. That network includes ancient Indo-Iranian Soma and Halma rites, ancient Greek mystery religions, African and Amazonian plant diets, and shamanic systems across the world. Ancient Greek Eleusinian mysteries used a sacrament called kykeon to induce ego dissolution. This mirrors the Vajrayana goal of using Amrita to experience sudden non-dualism or ego loss. Many indigenous shamanic systems use plants directly to interface with the spirit world and induce visions. While Vajrayana masters engaged in visionary practices, they used entheogens primarily as an alchemical support for internal meditative transformation, rather than direct spirit communication. Indigenous systems often involve communal, ritual consumption. Conversely, in historical Buddhist contexts, such use was typically localized to secretive elite adept circles. Buddhism's unique contribution is its insistence that no experience, even bliss, is final unless it is integrated with insight into emptiness and ethical discipline. That requirement protects the path from becoming a mere exchange of intoxication for enlightenment, while still allowing for transformative ritual and contemplative states. Before we come to a close, let's explore the Tibetan Book of the Dead and the forefront of modern scholarship surrounding Buddhist psychedelics. And then I'll give my thoughts on a conference that I attended on psychedelic Buddhism to end this exploration. In the 1950s and 1960s, the modern psychedelic era intersected with the American reception of Buddhism, especially as seekers looked for alternatives to conventional religion and material culture. Timothy Leary and Richard Alpert, later known as Ram Dass, became emblematic of this period, because their early work at Harvard helped normalize the idea that consciousness could be studied experimentally through psychoactive sacraments, and then interpreted through spiritual frameworks. Their trajectories, along with others in the counterculture, helped create a bridge between Eastern contemplative systems and Western psychedelic experiences. One of the earliest translations of a Tibetan text into English was the so-called Tibetan Book of the Dead, in which various visionary gods and Buddhas are described. This text, called the Bardo Thadal, explains that visions of these deities may occur in certain meditative states, and that they appear to each of us after death. It advises us to maintain meditative detachment when confronted with these apparently powerful beings, whether peaceful or wrathful, as they are all merely projections of one's own fundamentally enlightened mind. Timothy Leary, prophet of LSD, read this book and recognized it to be excellent advice for anyone experiencing the effects of LSD, psilocybin, or similar sacraments. Such good advice, in fact, that he co-wrote an updated edition of the Tibetan Book of the Dead, expressly intended as a guide to entheogenic exploration, called the Psychedelic Experience. The Tibetan Book of the Dead, or the Bardo Thadal, describes a sequence of events. First, an ineffable state of transcendence. Then there are visions, which may be divine or demonic, and finally re-entry into the mundane world or rebirth. This sounds remarkably like a psychedelic trip. Obviously, the ancient Tibetans had no LSD, so how are we to explain these similarities? Perhaps some Tibetan yogis had discovered a technique, probably through meditation or yoga, for inducing the same brain conditions as in a psychedelic state. Or perhaps, as we have seen, Vajrayana Buddhism is full of references to psychedelic potions, and Tibetan yogis could have had their own psychotropic herbs. In this sense, Timothy Leary's interpretation of the Tibetan Book of the Dead as a tripping manual may have been more insightful than he ever realized. Around the same time, Alan Watts bridged the gap between Eastern philosophy and the Western counterculture by linking the psychedelic experience with Buddhist, particularly Zen, insights. He viewed psychedelics like LSD and mescaline as tools that could chemically induce temporary satori, or a sudden glimpse of awakening, allowing individuals to perceive the interconnectedness of all things and break free from the illusion of the isolated ego. Modern scholarship and contemporary Buddhist writers often note that evidence for entheogen use in early Buddhism is thin, and claims that the Buddha's own teachings dependent on psychedelics are not well grounded in the earliest scriptures. Still, the absence of clear proof is not the same as proof of absence, especially in an oral culture where ritual life could be local, flexible, and not always preserved in canonical texts. At the same time, the modern psychedelic era reopened ancient questions about visionary experience, ritual, symbolism, and the possibility that sacraments might serve as catalysts rather than destinations. In this landscape, Lama Mike Crowley's work presents psychedelic Buddhism as a practical conversation between Buddhist maps of mind and the disciplined use of entheogens, especially for practitioners who want structure, symbolism, and ceremonial containment. Crowley and others suggest that the concept of Amrita, or the elixir of immortality, originally involved psychoactive sacraments, such as Amanita muscaria mushrooms or cannabis, which were encoded in mythic legends and iconographic artwork. Crowley's thesis suggests that early tantric adepts called siddhas consumed the Amanita muscaria or fly agaric mushroom, and perhaps psilocybe cubensis or magic mushrooms, as secret ingredients in their elixirs to achieve enlightenment, often cloaking these practices in alchemical symbolism and mythologies. Douglas Osto's study places the phenomenon in American religious history, showing that this fusion emerged most visibly in the 1960s, when seekers combined psychedelics and meditation in search of direct experience and spiritual authenticity. Osto's work shows that American seekers often moved in the opposite direction historically, beginning with peak experiences and only later discovering Buddhist discipline as a way to stabilize and interpret them. Alan Hunt Bodner's book Zigzag Zen captured that wider field early, gathering voices from Zen, scholarship, art, and the psychedelic underground to ask whether altered states can genuinely support altered traits. Bodner's anthology preserves exactly that tension, where some contributors honor the revelations of LSD, psilocybin, and cannabis, while others warn that Buddhism concerns transformed character, not merely expanded sensation. This book, Zigzag Zen, subtitled Buddhism and Psychedelics, contains many excellent essays on the relevance of psychedelics to modern Buddhists. These earnest deliberations may be beside the point. Examples of psychedelic Buddhism can be found from the 6th century CE onwards, and their precursors are even older. These traditions lasted for millennia, and as we have seen, may continue to this day, albeit in secret. Some modern practitioners suggest that certain substances temporarily alter brain activity in a manner similar to deep meditation, offering a glimpse of non-dual truth. However, Orthodox Buddhist authorities argue that chemical insights, while potentially therapeutic, lack the ethical and disciplinary cultivation central to the traditional path. In that sense, the path is not about worshiping the altered state, but about learning from it without being captured by it. That is the thread linking Leary, Alpert, Watts, Crowley, Osto, and Bodner. Each helps show that the real question is how consciousness is transformed into wisdom. And that question is what allows this subject to speak to a broad audience, from meditators and historians to artists, therapists, and seekers of every kind. Last year, in 2025, I attended the Psychedelic Buddhism Conference hosted by Psychedelic Sangha, which took place on February 21st and 22nd. It was held in a hybrid format with in-person sessions at Eugene Long College at the New School in New York City, and virtual sessions online. The landmark event explored the controversial, historical, and practical intersections of Buddhist wisdom and modern psychedelic practices. Notable speakers included Lama Liz Monson, Ian A. Baker, Eric Davis, and messages from Tenzin Bob Thurman. The event was attended exclusively by Western Buddhist teachers and practitioners, with a focus on shifting attitudes toward plant medicine within the Western Dharma community. The conference highlighted the normalization and growing sophistication of combining Buddhist wisdom with psychedelic practice, marking a shift away from it being considered merely a fringe activity. Participants noted that the intersection of Buddhism and psychedelics is moving into the mainstream, emphasizing that any philosophical or practical innovation needs to be grounded in the lineage of the tradition to be deemed institutionally legitimate. Discussions emphasized utilizing psychedelics to explore Buddhist concepts of anatta or non-self, recognizing the sandcastle of the constructed self through ego dissolution. While some view psychedelic use as a violation of the Buddhist precept against intoxication, many at the conference explored how substances can be used intentionally as medicines for awakening, rather than mere intoxication. A major focus was on what comes after the experience, with emphasis on integrating profound non-dual or no-self experiences into daily life to prevent spiritual bypassing, defined as using meditation or spirituality to avoid dealing with personal issues. The conference emphasized the need for grounded, embodied practice that connects to the elements of nature, moving away from purely intellectual or human-centric approaches. Discussions touched on the importance of maintaining respect for traditional non-Western Buddhist lineages while navigating the modern, westernized psychedelic renaissance. The entheogenic question in Buddhism is best understood as a spectrum, from ethical caution to symbolic nectar, to regional sacred intoxication, to tantric transformation. That spectrum helps us to see how Buddhism both resists and integrates altered states, making it a crucial part in the history of global esoteric and entheogenic spiritual systems. In our next video, join us as we move from the entheogenic layers of Buddhism across Asia to the entheogenic practices found in North and South American indigenous spiritual systems. There, we will explore how plant teachers, sacred brews, and ritual sacraments have been used in shamanic and ceremonial settings for healing, vision, and communion with the divine. We will trace the chronology of these practices, the vocabulary of plant spirits, and the ways in which indigenous cosmologies understand altered awareness as a sacred path. Join us next time as we move from the entheogenic evidence found throughout Buddhist history to the past and present psychedelic use in North and South America. Where will our expansive exploration of entheogenic or psychedelic plants found throughout global spiritual history take us after North and South American indigenous shamanism? Like and subscribe to find out. Thank you for watching. Find more at joinsek.org.